All right. Thank you, everybody. It's great to be here. So my name is Dan. I'm a software engineer at Netflix, and I was in engineering management roles for around 7 years or so before that. I'm kind of a recovering engineering manager. So I'm going to speak a bit today about additive hiring, right, and things that we can do to improve our hiring process. Because similar to being an engineering manager, nobody really teaches you how to do interviews. Nobody really teaches you how to hire engineers. You just kind of have to figure it out as you go. So before we get into it, I'm going to ask you kind of 3 questions to think about in your head. The first one, think back to a time when you saw somebody leave a company because they did not do a good enough job parsing a tree or using a hash map. The next one, think about a time when you're in a retro or you're in a discussion with a team around how to become more efficient. The answer to that was probably not, well, we should use hash maps better, or we should do a better job using binary trees. Lastly, for the hiring managers in the room, think back to impactful hires that you've made recently. What was a single reason for saying yes, or to moving on with that candidate over the other possibilities? So most of the time, engineers aren't leaving, teams are not improving, and hiring decisions are not being made based on what the majority of time is actually spent on in technical interviews. Now, you could argue that the reason for this is because we do spend so much time on coding and technical interviews. But I would argue that, if you think back to projects that are impactful, things that engineers have done that are impactful, the reasons for the things are not the actual coding aspects. All right, so we have hash maps, we have binary trees, we have linked lists. I would equate those things to my friend Beaker here. On the other side of the table, right, we have additive qualities and experiences. We have filling team or company gaps, and then business impact. These are things that everybody wants, right? We all talk about some version of up and to the right, all right? That could be up and to the right from a revenue perspective, from a team efficiency performance, diversity perspective, right? All of these things we want to improve on. And yet what we're going to talk about is none of these things you actually find by, again, spending too much time on the technical topics. So what actually are these additive qualities? Let me give you a couple examples. So 2 examples that I can remember from my experience. This one person who we hired, they came from an education background, and this really led them to the ability to ramp up very quickly. If any of you have ever worked in a very early stage startup, one of the key things is how quickly can you ramp up to be a part of finding a product market fit, right? You need to get there fast. You need new employees to be able to do that. And I found that folks that have an education background are very adept at knowing their own learning style, which means they know how to learn and they know how to ramp up. Not only that, this person was able to come in and actually drive the formation of the company culture, right? Now, does this mean we expected any less in technical ability? No, right? Like we still did the same day-to-day work. They were still writing code. We still asked the same coding questions in the interview, but the things that made them successful were not what we interviewed for. The next one. So the ability for product thinking. Again, in almost any company, whether it's a San Francisco tech giant or a 10-person startup, you need to have people that can use product thinking, systems thinking. And for me specifically, we had a team where engineering vastly outnumbered product. And we needed somebody who could come in, yes, write the code, but be able to really drive that product thinking forwards. Now, again, does this mean we expected any less in technical skill? No, right? Now, for both of these, you'll notice that I left level out. And I actually think level doesn't matter, right? There's no point in this talk where we're going to talk about leveling or any of that. So let's talk about the actual interview phases and kind of ways that we can find these things. The technical interview process is fairly standard across the industry, right? You go through kind of the first phase, which is a phone call, some sort of application submission, an ATS system, perhaps a technical screen using something like CodeSignal. But then you get into the actual tech screen, and this is where we're going to spend most of the time today. The second phase, the on-site, quote unquote, that's a whole nother thing. I only have 10 minutes, so I'm only going to talk about the tech screen. But what I'd like to talk about is, what does a tech screen even mean, right? Right now, it actually means an algorithm and data structure screen. When, in fact, right, the things we should be trying to find out are, what is the candidate actually good at? What can they add to the team? So I guess I put this question out there for those of you that are in hiring manager roles or that are doing interviews. Is this what you're looking for? Is this what your interviews are designed to get signal around? So let's go into how to actually do this on the tech screen. Again, the tech screen is kind of the gateway to the in-person round. And so I think this is one of the most important phases of an interview. So I'm going to talk through 5 different tips to you. The first one, we do need to interview for coding skills, right? But we can focus on details to quickly gauge what those skills are and then move on. So what do I mean by this? Say you're asked to write a function to find 2 numbers in an array that equals some other number, right? Yes, we're looking for can they complete that, but do they try to run the code at any point in time? Or do they write all of the code and then just hope for the best? Right? Are they naming things in a logical way? All these little details to show fundamentals that'll then show up later on in their work. The next one, this is not a PR review, right? As engineers, we often fall back to what we know best, which is writing code and reviewing other people's code. That is not what to do in an interview, right? You do not want to go into an interview trying to find all the things that are wrong. Again, we're trying to find what they're good at. We're trying to find what their strengths, not all the syntax errors that they potentially have. Once you get beyond the technical aspects, you want to find examples of where they work successful and why, right? What caused them to be successful? Again, it's probably not that they did an amazing job using a hash map. Right? It's probably something else that drove that. Almost every interview runs over time, and the thing that gets sacrificed are the candidate's ability to ask questions, right? These questions should be part of the interview. They matter, right? You can almost do an entire interview by just letting the candidate ask questions and seeing where that goes. Then lastly, and probably one of the most important things, you need to do interviewer training. Again, similar to engineering management, nobody really teaches us how to do this. We just figure it out. Well, do you want people figuring it out, right? Because that then affects candidate experience. So doing interview training on these things, having interviewers shadow other interviewers, right? Not something I see nearly enough. Now, some other interesting things that happen are kind of this relationship between company size and the focus on these additive qualities. So typically in early startups, we actually do a pretty good job, right? Why is that? Well, because when you're a part of a 5-person company or a 10-person company, you're asked to be involved in almost every part of that company. You're not just writing code. You're thinking about product. You're thinking about the customers. You're thinking about, how do we hire for these other teams? How do we find product market fit? And so typically startups interview for that, which is great. At mid-sized companies, it starts to go downhill. The additive focus shifts to maybe just a team, maybe an organization. This is the first time that you see this mentality of, well, as an engineer, I did this really hard thing, so everybody else should have to do this really hard thing too, joining. At larger companies, I've found that this additive focus is almost non-existent, right? And the reason for that is scale, right? We scale the interview process to become more centralized. You go through one hiring pipeline. You don't even know what team you're going to be on until potentially sometime later in the process. And we lose this sense of, well, what can the person really add to the team that we're working on? However, I would argue that scale is not an excuse, right? You cannot lose the focus on additive qualities just because you need to scale. You can still figure out what are they good at and what can they bring to the team to then help inform that team match process later on. So in summary, I'm not suggesting that we lower the technical bar. I'm not suggesting that we move the technical interview phases. I'm simply suggesting that we assess that part of it quickly, move on, And in addition, ensure that everybody in the organization or as part of that hiring process really understands what are the gaps that we're trying to fill, right? What does this team need outside of linked lists and hash maps to actually become more efficient? And what can we do to kind of really give them a great candidate experience? So we're looking for what can make each engineer unique and how to kind of add that to the company. Thank you.